All right, good morning. Why don't we go ahead and get started? We're so glad to hear, especially we've had to reschedule a couple times with the government shutdown, so we're really glad that you guys made it today. So I'm Barrett, and I'll introduce our speakers a little bit later. This is a Food as Medicine and Clinical Care Congressional briefing. So as a welcome, who are we? So the Healthcare and Nutrition Council, we represent manufacturers of enteral nutrition formula and oral nutrition supplements, or ONS, including those categorized as medical foods and parenteral nutrition. The mission of the Healthcare and Nutrition Council is to improve patient outcomes by advancing nutrition policies and actions that raise awareness and optimize access for people who require or benefit from advanced and specialized nutrition. We want to say a special thank you today to our representatives that are here to do some welcoming remarks, Dr. Greg Murphy and Dr. Kim Schreier. And then also we want to thank Representative Kagan's office for helping us secure the meeting room. I also want to say a thank you to the National PKU Alliance, Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, HCU Network America, and Improve Care Now, who are helping support this briefing today. We appreciate these patient groups who were able to help us identify our guest patient advocates that are here today to speak about their lived experience. And we also are putting some video testimonies on our Healthcare Nutrition Council's website. So the first thing I'd love to do is we're especially grateful to have our representatives here today. So I'm going to introduce both of them, and then you all can just come up. So first we have Representative Dr. Greg Murphy, who is the only practicing surgeon in Congress who continues to care for patients in Eastern North Carolina while serving as co-chair of the GOP Doctors Caucus. His background spans decades of clinical practice, medical missionary work, and bipartisan leadership on major health policy issues, including authorizing North Carolina's STOP Act and HOPE Act to combat the opioid epidemic. In Congress, he serves on the Ways and Means Health Subcommittee and has been leading voice for the DME POS policy, including co-leading the recent letter urging CMS to withdraw competitive bidding expansions into prosthetic supplies. And then we also have Representative Kim Schreier. Dr. Schreier is the first pediatrician ever elected to Congress, bringing decades of clinical experience caring for children and firsthand insight as someone living with type 1 diabetes. She serves on the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee, where she champions policies that improve access, affordability, and outcomes for families and people with chronic conditions. Representing Washington's 8th District, she draws on her background in medicine, science, and public education to advance legislation that strengthens the healthcare system for both patients and providers. So please, let's welcome them to the podium.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Just checking out the food over there. Nothing like a little bit of peer pressure, right? I would like to welcome you all to the Hill. I think that the focus, we've had a good focus with this administration about changing some of the narratives about the food that we take in and the food that we eat. I think this is a critical, long overdue initiative that we've seen the rise in highly processed foods, and the food that we take in is really not good for our bodies. And let me speak to three things just I can say from my clinical practice. Dr. Schreier sees, she's a pediatrician. I still see a lot of little kids just in my surgical practice. And I have seen over the last 30 years just the rise in childhood obesity, primarily because of what is taken in. Sadly enough, I live in Eastern North Carolina where there are a lot of food deserts where people don't have access to good, healthy food. But it's also not in the mindset of the young parents to say, hey, this is an important thing. And this is where the narrative hopefully is changing. You can't legislate, you can't dictate people to eat healthy foods, but you can change the narrative in what's available for people. You try to do those type of things. The number of kids now who are suffering from obesity, you look at who can even get into the military now, it's a tragic consequence. I see this all the time. In my operative world, we always, if there is time, to try to change somebody's nutritional status, because when you go into surgery, it is a catabolic state. It is something that is a damage to you, is a danger to you, and being in the best nutritional status possible is critical for a good surgical outcome. I do a lot of oncology work, a lot of big surgical cases where there is a huge catabolic response to people. And if people don't have high enough protein stores, they don't have a high enough nutritional status, their outcome is severely, severely affected. And so as we look to what goes in our bodies, how critically important it is, I started drinking muscle milk, don't judge me. Try to build up my own protein stores, which I think is critical for us. I don't think we get enough protein in some of the other things that we do. And good for me is I love a potato chip. I've gone to Potato Chips Anonymous, and I'm recovering now. That I've just tried to really personally actually do a little bit more healthy things. Finally, in the world of enteral nutrition that you guys were talking about, I will tell you 30 years ago in critical care, we had no idea how critically important it is to feed patients postoperatively. And enteral nutrition is one thing, parenteral is another. Enteral is always better, and it has gotten to the point really, especially in the world of cancer surgeries where we do big surgeries which are traumatic to patients. The sooner we can feed patients, the better. They truly do so much better. And some of that is just enteral nutrition, which has come literally light years as far as being able to really help reestablish patients' nutritional status. So welcome to the Hill today. I know Dr. Schreier's comments will be a lot more illustrative than mine, but I hope this is a wonderful thing. And again, I'm really glad that this is now in the forefront of the discussion so we actually do things that are healthy for our bodies. So thank you all very much. God bless. Have a great day.
Isn't it good to see Democratic and Republican doctors working together on common topics? And we probably went to medical school around the same time. And I remember being in my surgical rotation, and the question came up about what nutrient do post-op patients need most? And that was a big discussion about protein and the need for that with healing. As you heard, I'm a pediatrician. I'm Kim Schreier. I come from Washington State. And so we think about a little bit different things when we think about nutrition. Of course, every day we talk about kids and the need to, eat close to the earth and have healthy nutrition as building blocks. But when we talk about medically necessary nutrition supplements, I go straight to my patient with PKU. And who pays for that supplement for the rest of her life? I go straight to those patients with glycogen storage disease. And what about those, what we used to use, I haven't taken care of a patient with this for a while, but it was these cornstarch bars that you could give at night and it would keep their blood sugars stable. Is that still, anybody take care of those kiddos? So. Okay, there we go. So that's what we'd use. Who pays for that for those kiddos, or even people with type 1 diabetes who hit really low blood sugars in the middle of the night who benefited from the same thing? What about our kids with anorexia who are in the hospital and they're recovering? Boost, Ensure, the things that will get them the most calories in the smallest amount so you can nurse them back to health. I think about this little baby with short gut syndrome. They can only handle so much enterically, and it's really important for kids too, whether it's neck or whether it is short gut, to do whatever you can with their little bit of gut left, so that even if you just drip in formula, it is something, and that is medically necessary food as well. And then we were just talking about the ketogenic diet for some kids with intractable epilepsy. And so I just think about what you're advocating for, that these foods truly are medicines, and they're life-saving, and they should be treated that way by insurance companies as a medicine. And so I just want to thank you for your advocacy, and I'm really happy to be able to speak with you and to advocate for you. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I think well said from both of them, so thank you so much. So I want to talk about the objectives today. So to be able to identify the differences between medical foods, oral nutrition supplements, and conventional foods. To recognize the necessity for medical foods and oral nutrition supplements and some of the challenges for patient access. And also explain why oral nutrition supplements should be included in food as medicine legislation. So to give an overview, there is a spectrum of specialized nutrition available for people who have different diseases or conditions. So parenteral nutrition, or PN, is fed through the vein with an IV for someone who cannot use their gut. Enteral nutrition, or EN, is liquid nutrition that's fed through a feeding tube into the gut, or it could be taken orally. So in either case, with parenteral or enteral nutrition, someone could be prescribed sole source, to use either of these as sole source nutrition or supplemental nutrition, depending on their situation. So some examples that we have when we see enteral nutrition, examples that we would have would be specialized oral nutrition, including medical foods, oral nutrition supplements, or ONS. These are regulated under the term foods for special dietary use, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Both of them could be prescribed or recommended for sole source or supplemental nutrition. Medical foods are meant to support a certain disease or condition or a physical impairment that impacts the ability to eat normal conventional foods. They're usually uniquely prescribed and formulated to meet unique needs of an individual. So a quick example would be for a medical food for someone with inborn error of metabolism. Their body just is unable to digest or metabolize a certain amino acid. So in this case, the medical food that's recommended would be a complete protein minus that amino acid that would otherwise be harmful to them. And then oral nutrition supplements, these are nutrient-dense foods, liquids that someone could take. They're recommended by healthcare providers. They especially are used in the cases of malnutrition to help prevent or alleviate risk of malnutrition. And we've often heard stories of patients that use oral nutrition supplements maybe as a meal replacement. They sometimes are used when they just can't otherwise tolerate a meal, for example. So specialized nutrition products, they differ from conventional foods. They could be used every day, it depends on the person, and they do have different labeling and regulatory requirements that we're going to be talking about today. They're also handled differently in insurance plans or with the food assistance programs. The most important thing today, the Food is Medicine initiative and bills that are out there, we would love them to recognize the spectrum of nutrition needs and people who use these kinds of products. Not everyone can eat conventional foods, and so we want to recognize the voices of these patients when we think about the Food is Medicine conversation. So a quick overview today, just getting into, again, medical foods, oral nutrition supplements. They have their own unique regulations that are different from conventional foods, dietary supplements, and pharmaceuticals. These products are formulated specially, and they might be used as sole source nutrition. They are life-saving, so again, as we've talked about earlier, where they fit into the Food is Medicine conversation really needs to be considered. And again, they also help prevent malnutrition, which is certainly a very costly disease to our healthcare system. People that are impacted by malnutrition, it can cost upwards of over $100 billion annually. This slide is rather complicated, but we will make the slides available afterwards on our website. The main thing to understand here is that, again, with malnutrition being very expensive, there's unintended consequences of malnutrition, like hospital readmission rates. There is a lot of older adults that are especially at risk for readmission and malnutrition risk. So oral nutrition supplements, they're a tool that could be a way to help treat or prevent malnutrition, and they've been proven to help save healthcare costs. So Jessica, one of our speakers, will be talking a little bit more about the nuances a little bit later today, but just quickly to provide the background with oral nutrition supplements, they are used as in clinical practice guidelines. They do have some insurance coverage, depends on the plan. There's some HSA coverage with medical necessity documentation. They are available over the counter, and they're certainly recommended by healthcare providers. And then similarly with medical foods, a little different here, but they're also included in clinical guidelines for patient care, used under the supervision of a physician. And again, health insurance is really going to vary, but the big thing to take away is that access can be a challenge and insurance can be difficult, and that's part of our discussion today. So allow me to introduce our speakers. We'll move on with our agenda today. So I'm Barrett Doctor, and I'm a registered dietitian and the Associate Director of the Healthcare Nutrition Council. I'm the moderator today. Our Panel of speakers include Dr. Eric Kossoff, who's a professor of neurology and pediatrics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Kossoff is a pediatric epilepsy specialist and the medical director of the Pediatric Ketogenic Diet Center at Johns Hopkins. He's one of the world experts on the ketogenic diet therapy for neurological disorders and a founding member of the International Neurologic Ketogenic Society. He's dedicated to bringing the use of diet therapies to neurologic disorders to the entire world. Within the ketogenic diet therapy field, he's interested in infantile spasms, epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures, GLUT1 deficiency syndrome, simplifying the initiation and maintenance of diet therapy, and expanding first-line use. Dr. Kossoff is very involved in teaching and mentorship and is a director of Child Neurology Residency Program at Johns Hopkins. We're also going to have patient testimonies today, so our patient advocates include Becky Wolf and Ben Lewis. We also have a couple other videos that we're putting on our HNC website for other patient stories. Becky was diagnosed with severe refractory Crohn's disease at age 7 and treated with surgeries, parenteral nutrition, and enteral nutrition. She's a longtime advocate with Improve Care Now and a current ICN board member. Becky will share how medical nutrition has shaped her health, education, and commitment to expanding access to essential nutrition therapies. Then we'll have Ben Lewis, who was diagnosed with classical homocystinuria through newborn screening. Ben has relied on metabolic formula and a very low-protein diet throughout his life. He has expanded considerable time and efforts in navigating insurance hurdles to maintain consistent and affordable access to medical foods and formula, and credits the Massachusetts strong medical nutrition laws for supporting positive outcomes. He's active in the HCU community, and he highlights why medical foods are essential for long-term health. Then we also have Jessica O'Connell, who co-chairs Covington's market-leading global food, drug, and device practice group. Drawing from nearly 20 years of experience working at FDA and in private practice, Jessica provides strategic advice to a broad range of companies and trade associations in navigating regulatory frameworks and engaging with food and drug regulatory bodies and Congress. Jessica's practice focuses on food and beverage, dietary supplements, cosmetics, and over-the-counter drugs. Jessica has specific expertise regarding the regulatory framework for new and emerging food technologies, including alternative protein ingredients and products and specialized nutrition products such as infant formula and medical foods. So to kick us off, I'm going to have Jessica come up and give us a background on all the definitions.
Thanks, Barrett. So I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to make this about the law, but I think it's really important because I think there have been some challenges in the way kind of medical foods can innovate and how they can be marketed based on the definitions that are in the statute and in FDA's regulations and kind of how FDA has approached those. And so I wanted to start with that and just kind of lay that foundation in thinking about kind of potential challenges and paths for advancement. So from FDA's perspective, FDA classifies the products that they regulate based on intended use. And so the FDCA is FDA's statute, and all of the definitions in that statute talk about intended use. So if a product is intended for a certain use, it falls into a certain definition. And so FDA has talked about how the agency looks at intended use and where you can get intended use from. And really primarily what FDA looks at is claims, and so they look at how a product is marketed, but they also look at how a product is intended to be used even if there aren't claims. They look at how a product has been studied, and so if it's been clinically researched or otherwise, kind of what has been evaluated as part of that research. And so they're really looking at a range of different aspects of a product to try to understand what it's intended to be used for. And why is this important? Like I said, every product category that FDA regulates has a definition, and that definition talks about intended use. And so in the food category, there's a range of possibilities. There's conventional food, which we won't talk about today, and that's really just conventional products that you buy on a store shelf. There are traditional dietary supplements, and traditional dietary supplements really are intended for the healthy population. And so the way that they're studied and the way claims are kind of developed for those products, they're intended for the healthy population. And then we have kind of a subcategory of what I'll call specially formulated foods. That's not a term from FDA statute or from the regulations, it's just a term I use. But really, that's where the foods we're talking about today. So products that are specially formulated for people who might not be healthy, who have a certain disease or condition that need that special formulation. And so I'm going to go through kind of in a bit more detail those definitions. I won't focus on these definitions. I will say that the definition of food is an article used for food, and so that's quite circular, but really it encompasses a range of things. And then, like I said, a dietary supplement is generally intended for someone who's healthy. For a healthy individual, it's supplementing the diet, it's providing a certain nutrient or kind of combination of nutrients for that population. But the primary categories we're going to talk about today are the food for special dietary use, like Barrett said, and also a medical food. And so these are two definitions that kind of have evolved over time, and I thought it was important to really put them on the screen and look at, kind of what the words are. And so I'll start with the medical food, because this is the category that FDA has considered to be quite a narrow category historically. And so this is really a product that is intended to be used under the supervision of a physician and intended for the specific dietary management of a disease or condition. And so the starting point is there a disease or condition that requires specific dietary management? If there is, a medical food can be used for that purpose. Food for special dietary use is kind of a broader category. So this is actually the category that existed before dietary supplements were dietary supplements. So kind of going way back decades, food for special dietary use was very broad. But now it's really intended to cover kind of the category of products where it might serve a particular need or purpose for a person with a disease or condition, but it's not as kind of specially formulated as a medical food. And so it's, like I said, a broader category. Food for special dietary use can be sold in conventional stores. They might not be used under the supervision of a physician. They could be used in hospital settings as well, but there's really a broader kind of scope of use there. And the reason this is important is because aside from these two categories, foods shouldn't be intended for people with disease or condition. And so, other than these two categories, a product that's marketed for someone with a disease or condition would generally be considered to be a drug and subject to a range of FDA's drug requirements. And so when thinking about foods that really are intended for use kind of as medicine and kind of in that space, we want to think about these two categories and think about how products can fit within these two categories so that FDA allows them to be marketed so that they can potentially get reimbursement, so that there can be innovation, they can be studied, et cetera. So we'll just start with these definitions. I'm going to come on kind of after the rest of the speakers and talk about some more policy considerations, but just wanted to lay that groundwork at the start.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for all of you attending this early in the morning. I'm Dr. Eric Kossoff. So like Dr. Schreier, I am a pediatrician. Unlike Dr. Murphy, I am a neurologist, not a urologist. The hospital operator often gets that mistaken. I say, no, I'm neurology, not urology. So I take care of children with epilepsy primarily. And so what I'm going to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is sort of give you an overview of sort of my life sort of in child neurology, what I do with the ketogenic diet, and how medical foods can really play a role in what I do and really making it easier for our patients, both children and adults who go on these therapies for epilepsy. These are some of my disclosures, some related to the ketogenic diet field, some elsewhere. Epilepsy, incredibly common. November actually was just Epilepsy Awareness Month. People don't realize how common epilepsy is. 1 out of 26 people has epilepsy. My clinic is very busy. This afternoon is completely full when I get back to Baltimore. The Epilepsy Foundation really tries to highlight that for people to realize that it's more common than a lot of other disease processes out there, 1 out of 26. It can occur at any age. I see children down to infancy, and then I have partners in adult epilepsy that will see the elderly who present with epilepsy at that age. The myriad of causes is endless. So epilepsy is not just one condition. There are many, many different causes for epilepsy: genetic, metabolic, structural. So when we talk about epilepsy, as I will today, it's a lot of different conditions that can cause it. Can be a bit complicated. SUDEP has made the news recently. SUDEP stands for Sudden Unexpected Death in Epilepsy Patients. Thankfully, incredibly rare. These are patients with epilepsy, sometimes not well controlled, sometimes they can be, who will pass away in the middle of the night from a seizure. And Cameron Boyce, who is from the Disney Channel, recently passed away from SUDEP, made the news. People with epilepsy obviously didn't always know about SUDEP and what it was, and we're also trying to get that word out that it is a potentially life-threatening condition. How do we treat it? So most of the time we do drugs. 90% of patients with epilepsy are on anti-seizure medications. There are about 27 of them out there, so lots of medications, many different mechanisms of action, liquids, tablets, chewables even for some children to take. Lots of options, but medications are not always the answer for some of our patients. And so this was a very famous study in the New England Journal of Medicine, hard to believe now, about 26 years ago, from Kwan and Brody, where they looked at the outcomes just overall for what happens with medicines. And so 47% of patients, almost half, will respond to that first medication. Great news. Do well, you see them in clinic once a year, and just keep them on their medications. If that first medication, does not help, you have to go to a second medication. It can still be helpful, but not as much. So about a 14% chance of responding to the second drug. If you have to go to a third medication, you're in big trouble. And that's usually where we start talking about other options. Even though there's so many drugs out there, what else can we do? And so this was done in 2000. It was repeated, as you can see, in 2018 with almost identical results. So even after 18 years with lots of new medications coming on the market, we're really not impacting what we call refractory epilepsy, those patients who just do not respond to medications. And what options are there? So there are 4 major categories of treatment besides medications. As you can see here in the top right, we have epilepsy surgery, which can be curative if you know exactly where the seizures are coming from in some situations. Neurostimulation, we have a lot of electrical devices that can be implanted and can help suppress seizures. And then what we're all here to talk about today, food. Using ketogenic diets, using dietary therapy, as we call it, to help suppress seizures, potentially even cure them in many situations. This is sort of for the audience, not a big surprise, but right, Hippocrates talked about food as medicine. Our food should be our medicine, and our medicine should not be our food. What people didn't quite realize was Hippocrates was a budding neurologist. So in 400 BC, he actually spoke about seizures. They didn't quite know what was going on. They thought maybe it was possession. They had some sort of interesting ideas of epilepsy back in 400 BC. But Hippocrates said that the treatment for this was actually a patient who had epilepsy from burns, was abstinence from food and water. And then 200 years later, Galen kind of described the same thing in his treatise. He recommended abstinence from the daily use of such food as engenders unhealthy humors. So they knew back even 2,000 years ago that food and epilepsy were related, or in some situations, abstaining from food, fasting periods, could help suppress seizures. The most famous sort of reference to this was actually in the Bible, in Mark 9, a reference to a childhood onset epilepsy, and the child was brought by his father to Jesus. He fell on the ground, wallowed foaming. He asked his father, how long did it come onto him? He said, as of a child, so clearly childhood onset epilepsy. Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, he arose, and he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing, but only by prayer and fasting. So this is sort of commonly maybe felt to be the first epilepsy treatment in history, was fasting. Fast forward 1,921 years, so 1921. As you can see here, this small little photograph, Russell Wilder at the Mayo Clinic created the first ketogenic diet, with the idea being to mimic fasting, but in something you could do long term, because you obviously can't fast forever. And so the ketogenic diet was created back then as a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, which seemed to mimic the state of starvation in the human and could be maintained, although we now know scientifically they're actually 2 separate therapies. For many years, this is actually a graph showing publications over time. The diet was really kind of in a pretty bad state with all the new drugs coming out, lack of interest. It took 2 family foundations in 1994, the Charlie Foundation and Matthew's Friends, 2 parent-run groups that really got the word out to patients with epilepsy that this was a valid scientific therapy with many, you'd almost say hundreds of years of history. In the early 2000s, we had randomized controlled trials. We had a consensus guideline published. And then, as was kindly mentioned, maybe you can see up the top right there, our logo for our new International Neurological Ketogenic Society. At the 100-year anniversary of the ketogenic diet, we formed this society for those of us in the ketogenic diet world. 2025, it's incredibly popular. Patients ask about it all the time. Almost guaranteed today in clinic, some children who maybe have had their first seizure, the parents will ask me about diet therapy for epilepsy. Why? There's a lot out there about using ketogenic diets for obesity, for diabetes. The popular press loves the ketogenic diet, especially bacon. I think it's just very photogenic. They like to show articles that have bacon. You can see here Time, talking about a 90% fat being healthy. New York Times are about the epilepsy's big fat miracle. And then what probably really raised awareness in 1994 was a movie with Meryl Streep about the ketogenic diet called First Do No Harm. Families are very interested in it when you look at it compared to medicines, and why. There's probably 4 major reasons. Number one, it is unlike just prescribing a medication, you have a team approach. So I have a dietitian, a social worker, a nurse. We're all kind of together teaching families. So it really is kind of a team approach to using this kind of therapy. It is probably the only therapy in epilepsy where the patients or the parents can actually do something other than just give a pill or a liquid to help their child's seizures. So they're making food, they're making breakfast, they're making dinner, and if they do it right, the child can get in ketosis, it can help their seizures. So it empowers the parents. Even those where it doesn't work, the families will often tell us they had a sense of empowerment. Very different, and this gets into the basic science, but incredibly interesting why the diet may work. I don't have time for that today, but we do believe it's incredibly different than most of our seizure medications. So if the medicines aren't working, why not try something different, of course? And then although, it is a medical treatment, there is a perception, which we definitely, do acknowledge, that it is a more natural approach to treating epilepsy. As I mentioned, epilepsy can be complicated. We've come a long way in knowing who it works well for. This is from our consensus guideline in 2018, listing the top 11 conditions where it's not just 50% likely, which is overall that the diet's going to work, but in some cases, like GLUT1 deficiency, 95% likely that the seizures are going to stop. Incredibly beneficial. And so we're getting this word out to pediatricians. If you see these conditions with epilepsy, maybe try 1 or 2 medicines, but then get them to a keto diet center right away. So what actually is the ketogenic diet? There actually are 4 of them nowadays, many different options for our parents, like choices on a menu. They are all, for the most part, though, high fat, low carbohydrate, maybe moderate protein. So in this graph, as you can see here, this is your standard diet, which is, if anything, mostly carbohydrates. Most of these diets, again, as you can see here, are variants of just how much fat can be in the diet. And you say, well, how can a child do 90% fat for their diet? Pretty well. For the most part, pretty well. This is actually some photographs and drawings from some families that have been given to me for them on the ketogenic diet. Kids are pretty resilient. They're pretty incredible. For the most part, these are, again, foods that they like. It's really the tough part is the foods that they can't eat for, most of our families. The pizza, the rice, the candy that, can't really be on a ketogenic diet. But families are nervous, but they do surprisingly well. These are some of my superstars. One of my favorite pictures there on the right is one of our children just eating butter. Straight eating butter. Not on the menu here today, right? But like avocado, people love avocado, right? But just don't eat the toast that was part of the avocado. Otherwise, like, you're doing pretty well. Most children, okay, this is actually tolerable, but it can be tough, as you can imagine, for a child to be on these diets. About 50% nowadays of our children actually never see the bacon, eggs, and whipping cream in avocados. They are formula fed only. They're either infants or patients with gastrostomy tubes. And in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of ketogenic diet formulas in multiple different languages and countries that can be used by these families to supplement their diet or, in many cases, be the sole source of their nutrition. Incredibly valuable. There also are other ketogenic products that we know are available too and are often asked about by these families. Some of them are supplements that can actually boost the ketones, ketone salts, ketone esters. Many of you have probably seen some of these products on the internet or in some stores. There are many low-carb foods out there that are coming onto the market almost by the week sometimes. Low-carb breads and low-carb pizzas, pastas, things that can be done that can kind of mimic a normal diet for some of these children and can kind of keep them compliant. There also are low-carb milkshakes, things, again, that can be very helpful for some of my patients, especially the younger children. So when I was asked by Barrett to speak to you, we kind of talked about, what are some of the issues that would be a problem for me when I'm trying to prescribe this diet to families, knowing that these products are available, but knowing that sometimes insurance gives us a hard time. For the major part, it's really, again, most of these formulas. These formulas are helpful, but these ketogenic formulas are not fixing an underlying problem per se. They're not fixing epilepsy. They're being used to complement or, in many cases, be the source of nutrition for a ketogenic diet as a treatment for epilepsy. But this is where the insurance companies sometimes get into the nitty-gritty of it, and if it's 100% of their nutrition, that's when often they do cover it, because without it, they can't get nutrition, and this is a source of their nutrition. But in many of the other cases, it's unfortunately not covered. Most of my patients also are still on medications. It's usually an and, not an or. And so when the insurance companies look at the situation, they say, well, you're not really saving us money by putting them on this diet. And we're like, well, that's sort of true, right? They're still sometimes on medicines. We can often reduce the medicines. In about 20% of our patients, we can get them completely off their anti-seizure medicines, but it's not a guarantee. And so it is something that is a bit expensive for some of our families. A lot of our families are asking now about these oral ketone supplements that have come on the market in the last 5 to 10 years, completely not covered by insurance. And so some families are interested, but just can't afford them. All of our families need to be on vitamins and minerals. Without that, they can get into nutritional problems. They can really get deficient with it and have some side effects. For the most part, again, not covered by insurance. We actually have some parent charities at Johns Hopkins that give these supplements to the families because, again, they can't afford them. In some situations, as we're now moving forward with the diet and looking towards the next 100 years of this treatment, we're saying, well, if it works so well for refractory epilepsy, why not try it first? It makes a lot of sense, right? But most insurance companies are only covering the admission if they are refractory. And so there are situations where we will emergently try the diet, sometimes not covered by insurance, and then we put them on a formula. And again, if they're not completely nutritionally supplemented by this formula, insurance companies aren't covering these. So this can be an issue when we're discussing this with families. Some of them will go for the medications just because it's cheaper. These formulas are varied in prices. This is from what's out on the internet. For some of the more common ketogenic formulas, it can be about $10, maybe $15 a day, which you can imagine for a family that is doing sort of medical care and medications and other things, this can just be an added cost on top of their life. And then as I wrap up, just to show you, this is the tip of the iceberg. Stay tuned. Epilepsy is 1 out of 26, right? Cancer, autism, some of these other conditions, much more common, okay? And we're actually being approached now by many of these fields. You can see the top left is probably the fastest growing, Metabolic Mind, which is using ketogenic diets for metabolic conditions that could be perhaps causing a psychiatric condition. So bipolar, depression, people are looking at ketogenic diets for these. Migraines, cancer, autism, even dementia. They're starting to come, and we're, again, trying to be helpful, but again, recognizing some of the insurance barriers can be an issue. With that, I thank you for your attention. This is my ketogenic diet team, which really makes all of the magic happen, especially my awesome dietitians. And I'm available for questions after we're done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kossoff. So now I want to welcome Becky and Ben to share their stories. I'll invite them to the podium, and we're really grateful to have, the spectrum here with a physician who works with these individuals, and then also the individuals that use special nutrition products. So, Becky, you maybe want to go first? Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this morning and for your attention to this issue. So as Barrett just mentioned, my name is Becky. I was diagnosed with severe Crohn's disease when I was 7 years old, and I'm a patient advocate with Improved Care Now, where I've been for about the last decade. I'm really grateful to have had incredible pediatricians who noticed something was wrong early in childhood and who helped me get the care I need, guiding me to remission today. I got sick at such a young age that as a child, I didn't really understand something was wrong with me, and I didn't know what it felt like to be healthy. I remember being 8 years old and sitting on the sidelines of a soccer field, watching my twin sister and all of my friends play on the team. I didn't understand why I couldn't be with them, but instead I sat on the side wearing a winter coat and gloves, even though it was springtime. I was so sick and malnourished that I didn't have the energy to play on a soccer team or even keep myself warm. Crohn's disease can be very aggressive in children. It caused severe intestinal damage for me that impeded my ability to grow and thrive. I was very malnourished, constantly exhausted, and doctors told my parents that I was classified with failure to thrive. I was so much smaller than my twin sister that people would actually regularly ask how many years older she was, even though I was 1 minute older and made sure she knew it. I tried a lot of different medications. I tried immunosuppressants, steroids, biologic infusions, but I had a very refractory case and nothing helped me gain the weight. not until pediatricians recommended oral supplemental nutrition. For kids with Crohn's disease like me, eating can be very painful. I could never get through a full meal, and I remember crying in pain when I tried to do so. But these oral nutrition shakes were much gentler on my stomach and tolerable. But it was overwhelming to try to drink enough to fill my nutrition needs because I was so malnourished. So pediatricians recommended I try enteral nutrition, or nasogastric tube feeding. I started with exclusive enteral nutrition, consuming 100% of my daily calories through a tube in my nose. I eventually switched to partial enteral nutrition, and I used these tube feedings for 5 nights a week for 2.5 years between the ages of 9 and 11 years old. As you might imagine, this was incredibly difficult to do, but it was the only thing that ever helped me grow. There have also been times when these alternative forms of nutrition have been the only source of nutrition. In my first year of high school, I was hospitalized after doctors discovered that my colon was obstructing due to severe intestinal inflammation. They gave me 2 options: have my colon removed in an emergency surgery, forever impacting my life at age 15, or stop all oral nutrition while doctors frantically looked for a solution. I chose the latter. For 3 months, parenteral nutrition and IV feed in my vein was the only source of nutrition I had. I was not allowed any clear liquids. I eventually did lose my colon due to a combination of Crohn's disease and colon cancer. But parenteral nutrition bought me precious time to try other treatment options and keep my colon for a few more years. It also made me healthy enough that I could finish my freshman year of high school on time with my twin sister and all of our friends. I was very lucky that I could afford these treatments that my pediatricians recommended. My insurance covered the tube feedings and the parenteral nutrition, and we could afford the out-of-pocket costs for the oral shakes. But these nutrition treatments, while critical for many patients, are very expensive. This is what inspired me to donate my nasogastric tube feeding equipment after I had finished the therapy. And after years on that enteral nutrition, I finally became strong enough that I could join the soccer team. I remember running onto the field with my twin sister and all of our friends. I had struggled with that disease throughout my childhood, so something as simple as being able to play in a soccer team, as bad as I was at the sport, really just meant everything to a kid trying to be normal. There are so many patients who need these forms of nutrition but cannot afford them. And my story should be the story of all patients, being able to afford and access the care that they need. It is critical that we protect access to medical foods, especially as states like Texas are already cutting reimbursement for these services for patients on Medicaid. This issue has really inspired my career in health policy, as I'm currently pursuing my master's in public health at George Washington. I thank you very much for listening to my story and look forward to hearing Ben's. I hope we can make this type of nutrition a lot more accessible for patients like me. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you guys joining us. I'm Ben Lewis. I have homocystinuria, or HCU, as I'll probably refer to it throughout most of my talk. I'm actually really glad to be here as part of this event because HCU is a very rare condition. It affects about 1 in 200,000 to 335,000 people, so exceedingly rare. And so sometimes we don't get a lot of attention because there aren't too many of us out there. But I guess one thing I've been thinking about as I've listened to every single speaker is that there are themes here that each person so far has touched on that also relate to what we go through as patients with HCU. And so there might not be many of us, but I think the themes that all the speakers have touched on that Becky hit home on pretty hard at the end there, really also relate strongly to what HCU patients need to survive and live long, healthy, happy lives. A bit about HCU just to kind of set up, what we go through as patients. We face severe risk of a number of complications, and this can happen even with treatment. So I'm here kind of to talk from the perspective of a success story, although I don't take a lot of pleasure in that. I was diagnosed at birth with HCU through newborn screening. And so I've been fortunate enough to be on treatment throughout the entirety of my life. Even with that, myself and others with the disorder face risk of, particularly of blood clotting, thrombosis events, heart attack, strokes. That's the biggest issue that we all worry about throughout our lifespan. Children also face risk of lens delocation, skeletal malformations, osteoporosis, and other issues as well. And so the way that we go about making sure that we can strive towards a healthy, full lifespan is through a very low-protein diet. And we heard at the beginning of the day that protein is actually quite important to get, so we have to supplement our diet heavily with specially modified foods and with medical formulas to ensure that we're getting adequate amounts of protein that has been adjusted or modified to fit with the condition that we have. We also, in addition to taking those supplements and accessing specialty foods, we also have a few other medications that HC patients typically take. And, so for me, having been diagnosed at birth, fortunately, and, having lived in Massachusetts most of my life and benefited from the policies that are in place in that state, I think, what really stands out for me is that I have been fortunate enough to access the medical foods, the formulas, and the other medications I need at a fairly affordable level. It hasn't come without, sort of trials and tribulations. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. My family has put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into ensuring that that's the case. But the good news is that we've been able to do that on top of a foundation of policy that has allowed us to go and sort of meet our insurance company partners in a place where we can reach a successful outcome. I would say also that in addition to the focus on sort of Massachusetts and what that foundation is meant for my success, that we don't hear those same success stories in all the other places in the U.S. And so for me, as my family and I work within our community and with HCU Network America to support others with HCU, I think I was excited to have a chance to come to this event and talk to folks about a chance to make that experience and what I and my family have experienced in Massachusetts a little bit more ubiquitous and to kind of level the playing field in other places as well. This can cause all sorts of hardships for families. They, as we've heard, with other conditions, lack of access can cause serious health issues. People, experience those complications I talked about earlier. Or if they have access, it can be quite expensive. I mean, my medications probably cost, on a gross or sort of wholesale basis, more than $100,000 a year. So for a family to have to pick up that cost is virtually impossible. And so, I just wanted to kind of add in my story here, represent the community, the HCU community, and I think I'll just end by supporting what everyone else has said. I think the messages so far today have been really powerful, and I'm looking forward to going through our meetings today and talking to folks individually about my experience and the experience of other folks with the rare conditions that need these medical foods and formulas. Thanks.
Okay, so I think kind of what, hearing all of these discussions, I think going back to kind of these categories, right? Unfortunately, kind of in reimbursement, in clinical research, in regulation, the categories are what drive how something is approached, right? And so we've heard from everyone here that reimbursement can be a challenge, I think in large part because a lot of these products are categorized as food, and there's a lot more resistance to reimbursing something that's considered a food versus reimbursing something that's considered to be a drug. I think the same for FDA in terms of how they approach regulating these products, and particularly thinking about innovation and how these products can be researched and studied, right? And so another kind of set of definitions I have up here relates to clinical research, and this is something that I think HNC has thought a lot about in terms of engaging with FDA and getting support for ability to do clinical research. And so, as I mentioned kind of previously when I came up, a drug is something that's intended to diagnose, treat, cure, mitigate, or prevent disease. And so that's a very broad category. It could be considered to be a very broad category. Anything that mitigates disease in any way could be regulated by FDA as a drug. But what we've heard are examples of foods, a range of food products that do mitigate and treat disease in kind of that broader construct, right? The food is medicine construct. And so there's this tension of, if that is the case, and if we want to think about food as medicine, think about that holistically, what does that mean for those products? FDA doesn't regulate them as drugs and shouldn't regulate them as drugs. They're foods. But where is that space? And is there currently space for those products to be on the market and come to market, to be studied, to be reimbursed, kind of in that food bucket? So I've been a food lawyer for a long time, and I think every time we kind of get new leadership at FDA, one thing we hear about is this embracing food as medicine. We've heard it in this administration, we've heard it in previous administrations, and that is a really critical concept. You can't look at disease in a vacuum, you can't look at health in a vacuum, but the way these are regulated right now, they are kind of in these buckets. And so, you know, from a legal and regulatory perspective, that's the challenge, is thinking about how they all fit together. I'm going to skip this because I think Barrett talked about it a little bit, but I will say that kind of the category of medical foods is one that FDA has struggled with for some time, kind of given what I just said, right? Is that at FDA there's used to be a center, now a program that regulates foods, the Human Foods Program, and those are the people who are tasked with regulating that category. There's CDER, which is the Center for Drugs, and they regulate drugs, and those tend to operate pretty separately. And so from a medical food perspective, FDA has kind of looked at this category as one that should be construed and considered very narrowly. So they're thinking about food, the bigger category of food, and then they're saying, well, medical foods is this very limited category, and we should only really allow foods to fall within that category that clearly are medical foods. And so FDA has tried kind of over time to define this category and to put kind of boundaries around the category to think about what it means. And so the concept kind of first came about in the statute decades ago, and then FDA has gone through rulemaking to try to, like I said, refine that space. And so this regulation is currently what exists right now, and this is the regulation where FDA has said, if you meet these criteria, you can be kind of marketed as a medical food and exempt from certain requirements. Some of these provisions are pretty constraining. Okay, so the kind of the primary one is specifically modified for the management of unique nutrient needs that result from a specific disease or condition. So their FDA has said we have to have a particular disease or condition, we have to have these unique nutrient needs in a product that's really specifically modified for that disease or condition and unique nutrient needs. Another provision that FDA has pointed to is this nutrient requirements, the dietary management of which cannot be achieved through dietary modification alone. And so that's a kind of criteria that FDA has said, if you can approach this through other means, modifying the diet in other ways, then you don't need these specially formulated products, and so you might not kind of meet the definition of medical food. And so hearing, you know, your patient stories talking about how you might be able to eat butter and avocado and bacon, but that might not be the easiest, that might not be the most palatable, it might not be the most cost effective, and there could be specially modified products instead. There's a tension there, and I think FDA has struggled with that tension of, you know, do you kind of consider something to be appropriate if there's a way to accomplish it without that convenience. So I'm going to kind of skip through these, but what I did want to talk about is how FDA has regulated this, because this has been a space that's been somewhat limiting. And so what FDA does in regulation is they issue warning letters. That's one thing FDA does, and that means they send a letter to a company and they say, we think you're not doing this kind of appropriately. And over the last 20 years, FDA has sent a number of warning letters to companies marketing medical foods. And in those warning letters, FDA has said, these are all conditions that we don't think medical foods are appropriate for. And so this is kind of a long list of conditions where FDA has pointed to those regulations and said, we don't think these are diseases or conditions for which medical foods could be appropriate. Some of these are 10, 15 years old, but over time, that's kind of the narrow position that FDA has taken. And so this has been a challenge for this industry. And I worked at FDA and regulated medical foods from that perspective. I now kind of work with companies in this space. But it just really goes back to that concept of there are these categories, and FDA is trying to operate within these categories in the law, and that doesn't really work in kind of thinking about a comprehensive approach. And so is there space to push FDA to think more creatively about this, or is there kind of space for even legislative clarification there? The other thing I wanted to just touch on briefly is innovation. So I mentioned this earlier, but this has been another area where FDA has had concerns about companies conducting clinical studies on medical foods and whether those should be regulated as drug studies. So we've seen a number of warning letters from FDA where they have said, we actually think what you're doing is a drug study and you have to stop, or you have to get an IND before you can continue. So this is one example. But there have been a few warning letters from FDA on this point too. So this is another area where they're looking and kind of focusing on these issues. So I just kind of wanted to close thinking about some of the key policy questions and really kind of where there is space for kind of FDA to keep thinking and for industry to keep thinking and trying to work together. I think one is this concept of what is a distinctive nutritional requirement. So that gets back to the definition I had on the screen a few slides ago is does that need to be construed narrowly? What kind of does a company or does a manufacturer have to show that a medical food can be appropriately marketed? And is there space to kind of consider that more broadly in the concept of food as medicine? The second is kind of what are the requirements for clinical studies of these products? And is that a space, again, where FDA is going to approach that in a very kind of narrow way, or is there flexibility for more clinical research without triggering the drug requirements? Substantiation, and so how do companies substantiate the claims they're making, and how do they determine that products actually are effective, and what's the approach to research there? The other category I mentioned earlier were foods for special dietary use. So like I said, that's a broader category, and that's considered to be a broader category, but there's still some lack of clarity around what that category actually includes. And so how does that category mesh with medical foods? And like I said, those are really the two options for companies to think about in kind of providing solutions in this space. And then I think the fourth is kind of this more existential question that I have a lot of. How do you distinguish, and do we need to distinguish between disease treatment, which is typically a drug, and disease mitigation? And that's where I think the agency has really struggled, and I think industry has really struggled in kind of trying to fit products into buckets, right? And so disease treatment is disease mitigation. They all kind of are on the same continuum. And so just kind of thinking about the implications of having to try to argue that something isn't treating disease, but might kind of be managing disease, and how that can be accomplished in a way that facilitates the use of food kind of to manage a range of diseases or conditions. So that's kind of an ongoing issue, I think, and one that industry and HNC in particular has really tried to kind of move forward and tried to engage with the agency on. And I think that's it for me. I'm happy to take more questions later if useful.
Well, thank you. I think great panelists today. Hopefully this helps capture our food as medicine in clinical care conversation, recognizing there are specialized nutrition products that are not conventional foods and why they should fit into the food as medicine conversation. So in conclusion, we do want you to go back to congressional offices. Please protect patient access to medical foods and oral nutrition supplements. Recognize the important role of these products in the food as medicine conversation. And then we do have a couple of bills I'd like to mention. The Medical Foods and Formula Access Act of 2025 recently came out, so that's HR 5684. We are expecting the Senate bill rather soon. And then the Medical Nutrition Therapy Act of 2025, that's HR 6199, that also came out recently, and similarly, we're waiting for the Senate bill. We're happy to talk with your offices more about this legislation, but these are bills that we would recommend supporting. So if we can take some questions now, we have a couple minutes left, and we also want to let you know that the slides are up on our website, so you can download if needed. So any questions? I think, yeah, Jordan, go ahead. Oh, and here, microphone.
For Jessica. So my question would be more so in terms of, you were working within FDA and now you're outside looking in. What would be your recommendations or your ideal scenario in terms of trying to address this situation, in terms of whether it's reorganizing the structure of FDA or, taking on a legislative approach? Just curious your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's reorganizing FDA is probably a much broader thing that's been discussed, I think, a lot. But, I think that would have more implications. I do think there could be legislative direction to FDA to kind of, for FDA to kind of embrace the concept of medical food in a way that could facilitate the use of these products. It could help with, reimbursement. It could help with the ability to study, the ability to market. And so I think that's one thing. I do think, FDA is a regulator at the end of the day, and one of their jobs is to keep products that shouldn't be on the market off the market. And so often that approach is one of skepticism, right? And so is someone trying to put a product out there that maybe shouldn't be out there and put it in a category that it shouldn't be. And so I understand that, and I think that's an important thing. But also one of the tasks, particularly of the foods program at FDA, is to support nutrition and support innovation. And like I said, we consistently hear the food is medicine refrain. And so I do think there could be some legislative opportunities to refine the definition of medical food, to make clear that these are products that could be studied in certain ways and could be marketed in certain ways. That would be really valuable. I think, or just kind of, direction to FDA informally to do that would be helpful too. And I don't think FDA is trying to not have good intentions, but they're just kind of stuck with what they're stuck with, right? And they're stuck with definitions from the 80s, and this is a very different landscape than we had back then.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yep. Stephanie.
Hello, Stephanie with Nutricia. Thank you so much to our speakers who are living with this disease, your diseases every day. As we're about to go and speak with congressional offices, I'm wondering for you, what is the one thing you would want congressional offices to know about medical foods?
I think just really understanding that there are often patients who this is their only form of nutrition, or maybe it's not the only form of nutrition, but it could really change the trajectory of their disease and their life. And I think also, like Ben mentioned, you're hearing from us today because these were very effective and because we were able to afford them. And there are many patients who I wish had the stories that we have of being able to access these foods.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was baked into what I said, but just to make it really explicit, I mean, folks with HCU cannot live long, healthy lives without these medical foods and formulas. There's no other option for us. And then I think the only other thing I would say is the conversation about the terminology and the definitions of these, specific words, like this stuff matters because this is what we go through on a daily basis to ensure we get coverage that is hopefully affordable. I mean, in my case, the formula I'm talking about is sometimes categorized by my insurer as a piece of durable medical equipment, like a wheelchair. So it's like you really have to go into the weeds, and and right now, in a lot of cases, even when there is supportive policy, like in Massachusetts, it's still left up to the patient to do a lot of that advocacy work to ensure that they get access to what they need to live a nice life. So I think this is a really important discussion because of the necessity of it, and then also because the specifics really matter and they have a real life impact on people out in the world, individuals who need to then pick up that work themselves.
Barry Ritz, Nestle Health Science. I'll direct my question to Dr. Kossoff. So in terms of influencing Congress, insurance companies, even FDA, what can be done to be clear on the role of medical foods and ONS in clinical practice guidelines and authoritative statements from clinical organizations as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things we're doing, I think, as physicians is putting out the data, right? Like, here's outcomes when they're on these formulas. Here's what can happen to their seizure control. Here's, what can happen with their Crohn's disease. Here's what can happen when they're not on it. You can have a comparison group. That data carries a lot of weight. It goes into consensus guidelines. It goes into clinical practice guidelines that eventually, the more data we have, then national societies will endorse it. So in my world, like the American Epilepsy Society, Child Neurology Society. And so it takes time to get all the data, to get those societies to sign on. And once that usually happens, at least in my world, the insurance companies will take notice. If I try to get something approved, I can give them the guidelines. And 20 years ago, that was a big problem. Now it's a little bit easier. So, yeah, I mean, I think what we all can do is just, keep trying to get the scientific literature out there to support it. The patient stories are important, the individual stories, but also just the research, so to speak. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Well, we'll have the speakers hang out for a little bit after in case anyone does have a question. I think we should all give them a round of applause. Thank you guys for coming very much.